I'm a sports medicine physician and I practice in Sydney in Australia, and I've got a strong metabolic interest in my practice, and I see a lot of people with metabolic conditions, and I see a lot of patients on a variety of diets. I see people coming in on vegan diets. I see people coming in on carnivore diets. So I see the full spectrum. First of all, that's just madness. I mean, there's no good evidence that shows that we should be having seed oils. I guess part of the myth of how this got established is through an irrational fear of saturated fat. We've basically been told a lie. We've been told that saturated fats are going to kill us, when in actual fact, all the good quality evidence shows the exact opposite. And not only that the good quality evidence, the findings have actually been, I guess, swept under the carpet. They've been deliberately kept out of public view, including from scientists and medical doctors. The Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. And they were both randomized controlled trials that looked at what happened when you removed saturated fat from the diet and replaced it with vegetable oils, seed oils. And what they both found was that cholesterol would go down, but mortality rates would increase. And unfortunately, while these studies were completed in 1973, the findings actually weren't published until 2013 and 2016, respectively. So, I mean, they were completely swept under the carpet. This is an absolute, it should be a widespread scandal. The investigators in one of the studies were asked why they didn't publish their results. They actually said, well, we didn't get the results we wanted. They actually deliberately, they didn't get the results that would support their hypothesis that they personally believed in. The reason that we're scared of saturated fat is we're told that it will increase our LDL cholesterol level. And that's actually wrong on two levels. First of all, the best data we have shows that people with higher LDL levels live longer. On average, higher LDL level confers longevity. And number two, which is absolutely fascinating, is that there is no known mechanism by which saturated fats actually increase LDL cholesterol. Rather, there's known mechanisms by which seed oils reduce LDL cholesterol because they have these chemicals called sterols. They're plant chemicals, phytochemicals, plant sterols, that our body will absorb thinking that it can use it, but it can't actually assimilate it into the body, so it forces our cholesterol levels to lower. So when we talk about saturated fats increasing cholesterol levels, they're not increasing cholesterol levels physiologically. They're merely restoring them to a level. If any of your listeners out there and they get into an argument with or a discussion, a debate with anybody about saturated fats, ask them what the mechanism is by which saturated fats actually increase LDL levels. It'll be an interesting response. There's this belief that omega-6 fats, which form the bulk of the oil, the fats in seed oils, are inherently harmful. And that is demonstrably false. We've got two types of polyunsaturated fat. So a polyunsaturated fat simply refers to having a double bond between two carbon atoms, and that double bond is chemically reactive. It can do what we call oxidize. And that oxidation can actually be absorbed into our body and can do us damage. Poly, meaning many. So polyunsaturated fats have more than one of these double bonds. Monounsaturated fats like olive oil, which is constituted of 70% oleic acid, has only a single double bond, and saturated fats don't have any of these double bonds. So what actually happens is that when we consume a seed oil, a vegetable oil, we're consuming fats which are prone to oxidation, and the oxidation is actually what's doing the damage. It just so happens that most seed oils are actually disproportionately made of omega-6 fats. But it's not the omega-6 fats themselves that do the damage. It's the fact that whenever you have a polyunsaturated fat, it oxidizes rapidly within hours of production, literally within hours. And when you're consuming it, you're consuming that oxidation. That's the bad news there. Now, the arachidonic acid is a chemical that's formed from the omega-6s. And it can get turned into multiple other inflammatory chemicals. But in actual fact, the arachidonic acid is not inflammatory. It will only turn into these inflammatory substrates if there's an inflammatory trigger. If you remove inflammatory triggers, that arachidonic acid will sit there quite happily and won't do anything bad at all. Now, for proof of this, we go to one of the doyens of low carb, Jeff Volek. He was involved in a study that was published in 2019, and that looked at the fatty acid profiles in people who went on a low carbohydrate intervention versus people on high carbohydrate diets. And what they actually found was that the arachidonic acid level in the people on low carbohydrate diets increased. And this is hugely important to understand because every other inflammatory marker reduced. So it really goes to show that the reason the arachidonic acid was increasing was simply because it wasn't, you removed the inflammatory triggers and it wasn't being converted into these other downstream products that cause inflammation, that are associated with inflammation. The way to think about it is that omega-6 is an essential fatty acid. We need it for life. Without it, we die. The problem is that when we consume it from seed and vegetable oils, we consume it in an oxidized form. The best way to actually get it is from fresh food. So meat. So grass-fed meat's got both omega-3 and omega-6. And if the omega-6 or any of the polyunsaturated fats in that meat becomes oxidized, that meat would be rancid. And we don't eat rancid meat. We don't have rotten food. So if you're getting your omega-6s and omega-3s from natural food, then it's very unlikely to be oxidized. So that's a perfectly healthy way to get it. So fresh fish, don't have rotten fish. It's really quite obvious. So you mentioned canola oil. So it's interesting that you bring that up because that's actually the one vegetable oil, or seed oil, it's really a seed oil, right, that actually has a reasonable amount of omega-3s in it, right, a 2-to-1 ratio. And when you look at the data, canola oil is really no healthier than any other seed oil. So it really speaks to the point. It's not the omega-6s and 3 ratio. It's the fact that you're consuming oxidized products. And this is why, because most oils, however, are highly, they have a bias towards having far more omega-6s, that when we look at something called the fatty acid omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in your red blood cells, that people with a very high ratio are actually usually in far worse health. And that's simply because this ratio is a surrogate marker for seed oil consumption, because most of the 6s that we have in our diet is from seed oils. So when you consume an oil, you actually absorb the oxidation products, and those oxidation products get assimilated into the body. It can contribute to oxidized LDL, which we know is bad, and it's actually been shown to lead to fatty liver disease. We've got very good electron microscopy studies that show when you deliver oxidation stress to mouse livers that you generate basically fatty liver. We've also got very good studies that show if you want to exacerbate that oxidation load from an oil, the best way to do so is with what we call glycemic instability. Basically have your sugar levels go up and down. In this regard, they've actually done studies where they've actually looked at what we call the oxidative stress that's delivered to endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels. And they've found that fluctuations in blood glucose level are far more problematic than persistently elevated but flat levels of blood glucose. They did a really nice study. This was, but what they did, they fed people oxidized oils and they had them stratified into 3 groups. Some of them were healthy, no blood glucose problems at all. Then they had well-controlled diabetics, and then they had poorly controlled diabetics. And what they actually found was that in the non-diabetics and the well-controlled diabetics, that they could measure the oxidation entering the circulation and remaining in place for 8 hours after consuming the food. Wow. However, in the people with poorly controlled diabetes, So they're having fluctuating blood sugar levels. And remember, this is associated with extra oxidative stress. They found an increase in blood oxidation persisting for 3 days, 72 hours. So compare that, 8 hours versus 72 hours.
Right.
And that only difference, they were having the same oxidation load in terms of oil, but they were having far, their blood sugar control was far, far worse. And there's this nexus between seed oils and diabetes and poor sugar control that a lot of people don't understand. So not only does the diabetes make the oxidation damage from seed oils worse, but consuming the oxidation products makes your blood sugar level worse. It ends up in this little cycle.
Right.
So they did this lovely study back in 1965. It was the rose corn oil study. And that was probably the first randomized controlled trial that actually showed harm from vegetable and seed oils. They basically had a couple of different groups. They had an olive oil group, they had a corn oil group, which is a seed oil, and they had a saturated fat group. In the saturated fat group, over the duration of the study, it went for 2 years, there was 1 death. And in the corn oil group, they had 5 deaths. So the conclusion of the authors was that, seed oils really shouldn't be used, they shouldn't be recommended, and as you can predict, those findings were routinely ignored. But the really interesting findings from this study happens with when they discuss what happened to the individual participants. And they describe one case in particular who actually developed diabetes when he went on the corn oil, and then they stopped giving the subject corn oil, the diabetes disappeared. And they did this, no intervention, and they found that whenever they gave the subject the corn oil, his diabetes returned. And the way they were measuring it was with glucose in the urine. So when your blood glucose levels go extremely high, the kidneys can no longer hold all the sugar in your body, and some excess sugar leaks into the urine. So glucose in the urine, and it's thought to probably be about 14 or 15 millimoles a litre in the blood, that will lead to what we call this renal overflow. And what they actually, this is very good evidence of extremely poorly controlled diabetes. So these case studies are very strong indicators that you can basically lead to somebody meeting the diagnostic criteria for diabetes by giving them seed oil, and then reverse that by removing the seed oil.
Right.
So very, very strong links between seed oils and diabetes. Grass-fed meat does have one very important advantage over grain-fed meat, and that's to do with nutrition. So grass-fed meat will have better levels of vitamin K2, it will have better levels of vitamin D, it will have better levels of omega-3. So they've done some very interesting feedlot studies where they've actually taken what they call grain-finished cattle. So they spend most of their life on lovely pastures, and then they put them in a feedlot eating corn to fatten them up. And they do periodic studies where they take a sample of their meat every week or so for the 9-month period. And what you can see over a period of months is that you'll start out with a reasonably good level of omega-3 within grass-fed cattle, and over a period of time of exclusive grain feeding, that omega-3 will turn down to 0. So we know that 2/3 of the brain is fat, and about 20% of that fat is actually an omega-3, a DHA fat. So omega-3 is really important. So if you're exclusively consuming grain-fed meat, then you may be missing out on some nutrients. So yes, there is an argument for grass-fed and pasture-raised meat. However, this whole notion that it's going to be generating oxidation and it's going to be inflammatory and toxic and all of that, I don't think that bears scientific scrutiny. As long as you're making sure that you're getting your nutrients that you need from other sources, and maybe you're having regular salmon for your omega-3 and
right.
You're having other saturated fat sources of food that are rich in vitamin D and so on and so forth, then there's no real reason why you must avoid having grain-fed meat. Most of my patients will tolerate grain-fed meat very well, but understanding that it does have some nutritional deficiencies when you compare it to pasture-raised meat. That's the real reason why you go pasture-raised meat, not because of any potential inflammation. Remember, if the meat isn't rotten, if it's not rancid, then the fats you're consuming are not oxidized non-oxidized omega-6 is not inherently inflammatory. Remember the Volek study. Arachidonic acid, an omega-6 byproduct, actually increases in states of low inflammatory stress. You also mentioned the HbA1c there, and how that tends to be higher, or it can be higher in people on a carnivore diet. So here's two things. So first of all, recall that fluctuations and oscillations in blood glucose level are far more damaging than sustained flat elevations. And most of my carnivore patients will demonstrate superb glycemic stability. It might be a 0.2 or 0.4 higher than before they started on average. But if you actually have a look at it, there'll be virtually no excursion. It'll be pancake flat. Number two, using HbA1c often falsely elevates what the average blood sugar is in a carnivore. So let me explain. So you've got a red blood cell and it's sitting in a soup that contains sugar molecules. And over the life of that red blood cell, there'll be a predictable attachment of glucose molecules attaching to that red blood cell. And that will happen in a rather predictable fashion. We say it's 3 months, but it's strongly biased towards the most recent 6 weeks of the red blood cell lifespan. Now, the obvious factor that will increase the amount of sugar that attaches to a red blood cell over its life is the amount of sugar in the blood. But the other factor that a lot of people don't consider is the lifespan of the blood cell. Now, what causes blood cells to turn over quicker, basically to die and need replacing? Well, oxidative stress is a huge component of that. We know that people that have conditions leading to oxidative stress, like a G6PD deficiency and things like that, often commonly known as favism, then they'll have a very short red blood cell lifespan. Their red blood cells will often die. They'll have something called hemolysis. So if you actually reduce oxidative stress, your red blood cells will live for longer. And when you measure the HbA1c, it will appear as your sugar level is higher, because basically you're looking at a population of red blood cells that's had more time for these glucose molecules to attach to it. And there's actually a way that we can assess this. So a reticulocyte is basically a new red blood cell. It's a little bit different to normal red blood cells or mature red blood cells. It contains RNA and a slightly bigger. So we can actually measure the number of reticulocytes in your blood, and that will tell us how many new red blood cells you're making. So if we assume that you're in a steady state with regards to what your actual hemoglobin and your red cell count is, then your reticulocyte count will actually indicate if there's any changes in the rate of turnover. So if your red blood cell number is staying the same and you can see your reticulocyte count, as in the number of new red blood cells that your body's having to generate, is falling, that tells you that your red blood cells are living longer. And indeed, when I measure this on a lot of my patients, that is exactly what we see. The red blood cells are living longer, and that artificially elevates the HbA1c.
How do you test for the reticulocyte? Is it a marker that you can just test through your doctor?
Absolutely. Okay. How do I test for it? I write it on the form. At the end of the day, wear a continuous glucose monitor. If you're worried about your HbA1c being too high, then if you wear a continuous glucose monitor, it's a little disc, it just sticks onto the back of your arm, then what you'll get is real-time measurements over a 24-hour period for about 2 weeks. I think in the States, they last for 10 days, but in Australia, they're for 2 weeks. And that'll be communicated wirelessly to your phone, and that will give you perfect information on the trend of your blood sugar levels. You don't always trust the absolute level, but it's the trend that you're worried about. If you understand that variations in the sugar level are what generates oxidative stress, then if you've got a pancake flat trace, then you could really care less what your HbA1c is. So this is a study published in 1979 by Solomon, and they looked at if they absorption of zinc from a meal of oysters. And they first of all, the way they assessed the absorption of zinc is they measured the zinc in the blood periodically after consuming a meal, and they could see, okay, if the zinc is ending up in your circulation, then it indicates that you are actually absorbing it. That's basically science. And what they found was that when they fed people oysters and black beans in the same meal, some of the chemicals, some of the phytic acid within the black beans would actually bind to the zinc and stop you absorbing the nutrients within the oysters. And zinc absorption was reduced by 50% when you combine it with black beans. But the fascinating finding was when you combine oysters and corn tortillas, that the absorption of zinc was reduced 100%. Unfortunately, anti-nutrients don't just impact on the food that they're contained within, but they can impact on any other food ingested at the same time.
And I've seen that a lot. So I know that there are certain anti-nutrients even in teas and in coffees. And I see a lot of people drink their tea and coffee with their meats, which then can bind to iron, it can bind to other minerals. And we don't think of these things when we're eating certain foods. We think we're being healthier. It's just like how spinach has a lot of oxalates and that will bind to the iron. And so it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Basically, if you're having a food with anti-nutrients in it, and people still, if you do a quick Google search for it, you'll see that there's half a dozen vegan articles saying that, oh, anti-nutrients are actually not that bad for you, and they'll try and spin it in a way that they're good. But basically, they're sucking the nutrition out of your food. I honestly don't see how on God's green earth that anti-nutrients can be a good thing. And if you understand that it's not just that food that becomes deficient in nutrient, it's anything it's consumed with.
Right.
You can see that it causes huge problems.
And so I've recommended to some people that are really adamant about eating certain veggies, I'll say steam them and then, if anything, eat them by itself as a snack with no other food by it.
If people are taking heavy zinc supplements or copper or iron supplements or what have you, that for whatever reason. So a lot of my patients will be coming in and they'll be taking these supplements. And while, zinc, copper and iron, they're not the same as anti-nutrients. If you understand that they share absorption pathways and there can be competitive inhibition of absorption, if somebody is truly trying to increase their iron levels, then it doesn't make sense that you consume it at the same time as a zinc supplement, which is just going to compete with that. So, an understanding of nutrient absorption, I think, is very important. So over the last 3 or 4 years, I've actually increased my focus towards seed oils. And there was a 2020 paper published in the British Medical Journal that really explains why. If you have fructose-containing carbohydrates, they will still damage the metabolism. I mean, that's really not in doubt. The carbohydrate insulin model, that we know what that all is. But seed oils have really avoided being held accountable for all the damage that they cause. So this study in 2020, it was a UK biobank study. It was a prospective study on over 195,000 people. And they basically looked at mortality and dietary factors. Now, number one, this is an associational study, epidemiology, so you can't prove causation, but I believe it is informative. And what they actually found that mortality, so they found that there was problems when you had too many seed oils in terms of mortality association. They found that when you had too much carbohydrate, there was a problem with an increase in mortality. The interesting thing was, though, that they found that when seed oil consumption, percent of energy in the diet exceeded 6 or 7%, then the seed oils were associated with more mortality than carbohydrates were. Now, if you consider this 6 or 7% and understand that in my country, the average Australian gets 13% of their energy from seed oils, you'll understand why this is really the elephant in the room. The seed oils are really the big problem here. And I think that for most people, if low-lying fruit, if you've got a choice of reducing carbohydrates in the diet or eliminating seed oils, on the balance of probabilities, you would probably get better health benefits by eliminating seed oils. So the fact that they're high in omega-6 is why that we see these surrogate markers of the omega-3 to 6 fatty ratio in red blood cells being associated with problems, but that's an association The causation happens via oxidative stress, the oxidative stress making insulin resistance worse, the oxidative stress causing fatty liver disease, the oxidative stress contributing to small dense LDL. It's the oxidation stress that is the problem. Well, let's have a look at how this actually came about. Why do we believe that carbohydrates are necessary? It happens because in the 1960s, scientists developed a technique of measuring glycogen in muscles. And they didn't have much other technology, but they figured out that your high power performance deteriorated when glycogen levels were depleted. They also figured out that glycogen was made of glucose, carbohydrates are made of glucose. Therefore, it was obvious that if we just eat more carbohydrates, we have more glycogen, our high power, our anaerobic performance, our power performance, our strength performance is going to be better. And that was a paradigm which basically resulted from this one test, the muscle biopsy for glycogen levels. And nobody ever questioned whether carbohydrates actually were needed to maintain glycogen levels because it seemed so obvious.
Right.
Glucose is glucose is glucose, We don't really understand the whole physiology, but we don't need to study it because, it's plain as day. The fact is, it's not plain as day. The single piece of evidence on which this whole notion that you need to have carbohydrates for high-level athletic performance hinges on glycogen stores. So in 2016, Jeff Volek was again associated with a study where they published a paper on ultra-marathon runners. And basically what they did, they had some of the ultra-marathon runners were ketogenic and they were well keto-adapted. They'd been doing it for months. And they had high carbohydrate adapted athletes who were used to being high carbohydrate. And then they put them on a treadmill, they made them run a marathon. And before they got on the treadmill, they did a muscle biopsy and they measured their glycogen levels. And before they started, they actually found that the ketogenic athletes had exactly the same level of glycogen in their muscles as did the low carbohydrate athletes in the rested state. This is what you would predict. So the conventional theory is that after running a marathon, that the high carb athletes would have higher glycogen levels because they would be consuming carbohydrates to do the race, so on and so forth. What they actually found is that after the marathon, there was no difference in glycogen levels. And then after nutrient replenishment, in which the low-carb athletes were given fat shakes and the high-carb athletes were given carb shakes, 2 hours after recovery, there was again no difference in glycogen levels. It conclusively proves with biopsy-level data, you don't get any better experimental data than this, that glycogen stores are maintained on ketogenic diets in long-term keto-adapted athletes. So then the question rises, well, if this is the case, then you should actually see maintenance of performance. So ketogenic athletes shouldn't have any deterioration of power. They should be able to generate the same level of peak force. So in 2018, McSweeney published a paper, and basically they had high-level athletes who were self-selected to one of two groups, and they went on a ketogenic diet or a high-carb diet for 12 weeks. And at the end of a time trial, they measured them. They did two tests. So one of them was a peak power. So they said, they just measured what their peak power output was. And then another one was what they called a critical power test. So that went for 3 minutes and they had to sustain as high a level of performance as they could for 3 minutes. So a couple of interesting things. So on average, the ketogenic athletes did the time trial. They had a 3 minute better time. They also had higher peak power outputs and they did significantly better on the critical power test. So clear evidence that ketogenic diets not only do not impair anaerobic performance, but it appears to improve it at least 4 months. And the data will show at least 12 weeks to keto adapt, but probably I think even longer before you're going to hit your straps with performance on a ketogenic diet. Now, how do we know this? So when your body burns fat, it initially can turn it into ketones. But if you can't efficiently use the ketones, and the cellular machinery for your body to use the ketones does take some time to upregulate, then you'll actually expel some of those excess ketones in your urine. Now, uric acid and ketones compete for excretion through the kidneys into the urine. So that means if you actually have elevated ketone levels that are leaving your body through the urine, they'll actually prevent some of the uric acid from also leaving the body. And that means the uric acid level will increase in your blood. So we can actually use the increase in uric acid levels to see whether you're keto adapted, and then monitor that to see how long it takes to return back to baseline. And when we've actually done that, it takes at least 12 weeks. So from that, we can infer that keto adaptation for athletic performance takes at least 3 months, probably 4 to 6 months. Sex hormone binding globulin absolutely is higher in people on carnivore diets. It does go up. We monitor this. We can see it. It's very, very clear to see and very easy for us to see. So the question is this a problem? The old thinking used to be that sex hormone binding globulin would bind to testosterone, and that would prevent the testosterone from being inactive. So the truth is, we now know that sex hormone binding globulin bound to testosterone still has physiological activity. So this fear about elevated sex hormone binding globulin basically preventing your testosterone from having any physiological effect, that's not true. Further to that, if we have a look at what we call the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, so I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with Dave Feldman. So that's when people go on ketogenic style diets and their LDL cholesterol goes up, their triglycerides go down, their HDL cholesterol goes up. Yes. So as a part of that phenotype, I add sex hormone binding globulin. So it's my observations that when people start having those high levels of LDL, almost always they're having a very high level of sex hormone binding globulin. So it's not just isolated to carnivores, but I suspect that because carnivore is such a low carbohydrate and can be a high fat diet, that we're seeing that lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And I certainly don't see any problems with that. There's multiple things that make sex hormone binding globulin going up and down. But if I'm seeing it as a picture of that improved lipid status, that higher LDL, higher HDL and lower triglycerides, and also LDL, then that does not impair athletic or physical performance at all. I've never seen that. So what we do see is that people with chronic inflammatory conditions, and one of the most common reasons people go on a carnivore diet is to manage inflammatory bowel disease. Well, these kind of conditions are usually associated with very low testosterone levels. In actual fact, I'll always do testosterone testing, including sex hormone binding globulin, on my patients with inflammatory bowel disease, and it's often low. So I've not seen any data like that. I haven't seen that in my clinic, and that's certainly not my experience. The usual pattern we see is that when people eliminate inflammatory conditions, that their testosterone levels are restored to where they should be. Testosterone has what we call diurnal variation, and it will spike. So if you measure it at different times of the day, you'll have a different level. Yes. So you need to make sure that it's being tested. I always do request my patients have their blood tested in the morning fasted state so that it's reproducible as possible with consecutive tests. So you can't just be looking at serum testosterone in isolation if you're not taking into account the diurnal variations. And there's other factors that can involve. We often do see T3 going lower. So T3 is the most active thyroid hormone. Yes. And the reason for this is that it becomes more effective. So in the same way that your insulin levels will reduce when the resistance to insulin is removed, because you don't need persistently high levels of insulin if it's working better. If your thyroid hormone is working better, if your T3 is working better, you simply don't need as high levels. And if you understand that concept, then you go back and have a look at the TSH. And TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, the way this actually works is that if your body perceives that it doesn't have enough T3 being active, it will send a signal back to part of the brain called the anterior pituitary gland, which will then release thyroid-stimulating hormone. So in the state of your body detecting a deficit of T3 activity, it will increase the TSH. So higher TSH means less active thyroid. Usually what we'll see is that even if the T3 is going down, we will also see the TSH going down at the same time. And the TSH going down indicates that the body is perceiving an increase in thyroid activity. So this whole concern about T3 going down, it must mean that your thyroid is less active, that it doesn't reflect the reality. It's all about the effectiveness of that T3, and then you go back to the TSH and have a look at the relative effect. Now, it's also hugely complicated because a lot of people on carnivore have autoimmune diseases. They often find themselves on the carnivore diet because of autoimmune disease. And the most common autoimmune disease we have is something called Hashimoto's thyrotoxicosis. What this means is that your immune system is attacking this thyroid gland that's sitting in the base of your neck on the front here. Now, what actually happens is when you have an active autoimmune attack, then the preformed thyroid that's stored in the thyroid gland will be released. And if you have a pulsatile attack on the thyroid, you'll have a release of thyroid hormone in a pulsatile manner. So there'll be periods of thyroid overactivity when you're having this periodic activation of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In the longer term, once you've destroyed most of the thyroid gland, you actually end up suppressing the body's ability to secrete thyroid hormone. Basically, the gland's been irreversibly destroyed, and you'll end up flicking over into a state of persistent thyroid underactivity. But if you understand that this can complicate people's interpretation of T3, T4, and TSH, and you also need to bear in mind, do you have active disease? If you do thyroid antibody testing, you can often detect that you've actually got an autoimmune condition, and that autoimmune condition can lead to periodic hyperactivity, hyperthyroidism, followed by persistent hypothyroidism. So periodic overactivity followed by persistent underactivity. So it's not as simple as people would think. You can't just look at T3 and say, my thyroid's doing this.